Well, hello fellow humans and welcome to Building with Beetle. We have decided to go in and remodel this small village house. We are going to keep a lot of the characteristics that were originally with the house as we complete this remodel. So that's things like the original block palette, which you'll notice I've set off to the side, and keeping with the size of the house. So when I lay it out, I don't want it to be too big. I want to keep it in a similar size. It's definitely going to be bigger because the villager houses are incredibly small, but I do want it to be bigger than the initial house was. Once I have my wool laid out, I go ahead and begin by replacing that with the blocks I want to use for my foundation. In this case, keeping with the original foundation of the house, I opt to use cobblestone. Now I vary that some by including tough and mossy cobble just to kind of give it a little more texture, make it look like it's a little more overgrown. Maybe there's some moisture in the ground. When I start building up the walls, I start using the exact same blocks that were in the original house. So that's that white terracotta and the stripped oak wood. I also decide that I'm going to include an oak plank accent part in what I end up making a front porch. So I mess around with this front porch a lot. This is really just the first stage of it. So now that I have the front porch complete, I can begin to kind of lay out what I want the walls of the rest of the house to look like. Right now I'm using this really chunky outline, which on a much larger build would look nice, however with this very small build, ends up beginning to look very chunky. So I will go back in later and kind of slim that down. It's definitely a style that you'd usually use with more of like a medieval build where the top overhangs. However, that's not the style I'm going for in this build. I'm trying to keep it very traditional village style house. So you can see now that I'm going in with these campfires, and I'm using those to make my awning on my porch. I really do love campfires for that overhang because they kind of look more like a trellis. And my favorite thing about campfires is you don't need a bucket of water to put them out. You can simply use a shovel. It's also here that I opt for the unstripped oak wood for my porch, as I just feel like that gives some nice contrast to the very light colors of the house by adding in that darker color. I continue to play around with the supports and I decide that I would like a taller section on one side of the house, kind of like a little tower, just because I feel that that would give some nice visual contrast for this house. You could definitely choose to just roof the house as it is, but I always like when there's one section of the house that's a little taller, and that's something I definitely try to do here. Now, this is where I start to realize that the way I'm laying it out is just really bulky and it's not allowing for the upstairs to be as big as I would like it to be. So this is where I trim off those chunky columns and I start to slim them down. So at this point I've taken them all out and I'm just beginning to put them back in. And I'm building up this tower in the front section of the house. So it becomes like this little 3x3 room on the interior, which makes a really nice, just small upstairs. Once I have that in place, I can begin to think about other things, like the porch and the roofing. So for the roofing here, I start out with it on the top block, and that doesn't work out, so I bring it some blocks down, and I end up making this kind of like sharp arched roof, right? So it's more of a steep sloped roof, which keeps the house from looking super tall while still giving me the interior space to give us that second floor. So I check it several times and I really do mess with it. Roofs are one of those things where I find I have to consistently step away from a build before I can tell whether or not I'm going to like that roof shape. This is definitely a roof shape that I've grown very fond of, mostly because of the space it gives you on the inside, and it really is just a step away from that traditional stair pattern that's so commonly used. So I outline my roof in this deep slate brick, and whilst I was trying to keep the blocks traditional to the village, I ultimately decided that anything that could be obtained easily during an early game playthrough, right, in this biome. So for example, I can't use spruce wood because that's not in a plains biome. But I think I do ultimately use some birch because that's almost always readily accessible near a plains village. And deep slate, well, if you're going mining, you're going to acquire some. So that seemed fair game in terms of this build. And I definitely do like deep slate for roofing because it really does just mimic the shingles that are commonly used in architectural structures. Now this roof gave me a hard time. I wanted there to be a really flat part of roof on this half of the building, but what kept ending up happening was it was just too tall. It was running into the roof on that tower section, so I ended up making it a flat roof using smooth stone slabs. Did have to go in and extend some walls, but it ended up working. Now here I am on yet another rendition of the porch. I've extended it here, giving a little bit of a different shape to it, and making the house kind of extend without looking so cut off. And so I built up the porch and I start adding in like these railing sections. I've added a couple campfires going back and forth. So we've got this oak extended out, and we've got all the blocks on the bottom. And so what we're going to do now is we are going to go in and add the rest of the roofing. I find it a little weird that I skipped to the porch before finishing off the roof of this taller section, but in all honesty, my thought process just was, I was already down there working on the other half of the roof. Why not finish the stuff that was lower down before moving up to the sky? So I finish off the roof, and then I go back to the porch, right? So it's a little bit of a back and forth, but that's what ends up happening. So actually before the porch, I head inside to start working on the flooring. It's definitely a little all over the place by the time I got to this point in the build, but it's one of those things where sometimes you need to take a step away before you can continue working on the exterior of the house. So here's where I started work on the flooring, and I really did struggle with what to use for the flooring. There's not a lot of block options, and I couldn't use things like oak as they were already taken by the exterior of the house. And having oak planks up against oak walls just really isn't a feeling that I really like to use in a house. Now, I do add this really nice little oak accent here with the stairs that just gives the wall some texture and dimensions. Then I begin to go in and add windows. So you can't do a lot of detailing to a window at this scale, so what I end up using is fence gates. They make nice little like open shutter type things that I find are a really nice detail in smaller windows. So I use them on the windows on the side of the house with the trapdoors, and then I'll also use them on the taller windows on the towers. So once we get back around to the front of the house, you'll notice that I've gone around the other side to do the windows, and I'm adding in the windows on the front of the house. So the actual windows are made of fencing instead of glass paint. So especially in the early game, glass paints are really hard to get. So I wanted to keep this really early game friendly, so I tried to use easy to get materials. And I make these really cool like arched open windows with the trapdoors, which look a little bulky in game, but they're just a really interesting window shutter. It just adds something to the build. Now we're back to the porch, adding some walls and some fencing as some column supports, and for a nice little railing. Then we can begin to decorate our porch. So things like potted plants. I like to use azaleas in a pot with the leaves on top of it to make this really tall plant. I find it's just a little more interesting than just the azalea in the pot. Then I use benches for stairs, and I think I add like a tripwire hook as like, I don't know, a mailbox, a doorbell. I'm not exactly sure, but it turns out cute. Adding some stuff to make a little makeshift kitchen right in the entryway, before moving on to decorating the rest of the house. So things like carpets are always great little details for small houses. I do want to keep it original to the original house, so I add in a yellow bed because that's what this house originally had in it. And so we've kept a lot of that character all the way through. I also choose a poppy as my plant because, well, it's a village, and villages have iron golems, and iron golems have poppies. So I go ahead and add in some roofing. It's multi-layered, but tight spaces, right? You gotta do what you gotta do. Then I move on upstairs to add like a little office nook. So I end up putting in a little desk using some stairs and some trapdoors, along with a little hanging shelf where I think I ultimately put a lantern, right? So I use the chain and the trapdoors to make that hanging shelf, throw up a painting or two, and that finishes off the interior. Then I can go back outside to do just a little bit of landscaping. So add some leaves, a sunflower, because obviously it's a plains village and this one just happens to be in a sunflower plains, I think. So there's a ton of those around, and it really does just keep with the original character of the house. And so at this point, we are basically done with the build. We add in a little bit of glow lichen, just because it adds some texture to that white terracotta that, I don't know, I'm not a huge fan of like smooth walls on houses like this. And so now you can see the final product with the leaves out front. And I hope you enjoyed watching this. If you'd like to see more builds like this, let me know what building in a village you'd like to see me remodel next. And go ahead and click the subscribe button so you'll know when I finally get around to that village building. We're going to continue this series by doing some more village remodels, so some of the other buildings in the village, until we've finished out this entire village. So until next time, goodbye!